All right, so welcome to our journey through the book of Romans. We're going to be, I don't know how many weeks this is going to take, but I don't want to skip anything that is meaningful. I mean, I know in some parts of the books there are, especially in the last chapter, there are multiple greetings. Say hi to so and so and say hi to so and so. We'll find some things to talk about in there, but I'm not sure that we'll spend a whole lot of time. We'll see. But there are a lot of really heavy stuff in here. There is a lot of really heavy stuff. And I don't want to skip any of that. And I know that we have all been taught something about what Romans is saying. There are some very familiar passages in here, but I don't want to just assume that we know what anything means. I want to find out, why does Paul use this turn of phrase? Does he use this elsewhere? What does this mean in relation to everything else he's teaching, in relation to the things that Peter might have taught him when he was in Jerusalem, or that he learned from Ananias when he was in Antioch? All of these people learned from the ones who came before. I mean, Peter obviously learned straight from Yeshua, and Ananias probably learned from Peter or one of the other disciples. And we can see traces of Paul's thoughts in the writings of those other apostles. So we'll look at all of Paul's writings to figure out how he uses phrases and ideas, and then look beyond his writings to see how they're used throughout the New Testament. And that should give us a good idea of what Paul meant. I don't think it's reasonable to read any particular verse in the Bible in isolation and say, well, I know what this means in English. If somebody just said this out of the blue, well, that's not what it means in Scripture. You have to read it for what the original author meant, which means you have to understand who the author was, where he was coming from, why was he saying this, what else did he say at the same time. All of that is vital to really understand any book or any passage in the Bible. So it may take us a while, and it takes as long as it takes, or maybe it'll only take a couple of months. We'll see. Tonight, I don't think we're going to have time for a lot of discussion. I'm going to be introducing the book of Romans and introducing Paul. And that means that it's going to be mostly just lecture tonight. I hope it's going to be interesting and helpful. I don't want to be too boring. And maybe we'll have some things that we can discuss and look at later. Scott's having trouble finding the Zoom link. Brian or Carlos, would you mind texting him or something? And not sure how to tell him where that is right now. So we're talking about Paul. And let me move to the next slide here. Paul's Epistle to the Romans, that's the common name of the book. 5 W's. Everybody know what I'm getting at here? These are the 5 W's that you hear about whenever you write any kind of essay, or the journalists use. The who, what, why, when, where. So who, we know that Paul wrote this to the church at Rome because it says so right at the beginning of the letter. And it was written by the hand of Tertius, who was his scribe. And it says that in the last chapter. Whether Tertius had any actual input on the wording, probably he did a little bit. Whenever you have a secretary who's taking dictation, part of their job is to correct your grammar, to clarify your thoughts for you. But, then you hand it back to your boss, or the one doing the dictating, and you have them review it. Says, is this all accurate? And if it is, then you make your final copy and you send it out. And I don't know exactly what, how an ancient scribe in a Greek city would have worked, but I can't imagine that it would be too different from that. So what? This is a letter from a revered teacher whom the Romans had not yet met in person. So Paul had never visited Rome. He might have met some of the people who were there, but he hadn't visited in person. Most of them had only heard of him. Pretty much everybody, all of the Christians in the Roman Empire at this time had probably heard of Paul, but most of them have never met him. And that includes the church at Rome. When, based on mostly stuff that's in the book of Acts, it seems like Paul probably wrote this in 56 AD during his third missionary journey. And he was probably in Ephesus or Corinth or somewhere in that region at the time that he wrote it. So right on the, I can't remember the name of the sea between Turkey and Greece, one of the cities on those coasts. That's where he was at when he wrote it. And where? Well, I just said that. Sorry, I have more information than I thought I did. He was probably at the house of Gaius in Corinth, or in, the city of Corinth is in the region of Achaia. That's probably where Paul was when he wrote it. And the way that we know that is because in the book of Acts, they're talking about Paul's journeys and where he stopped and, where he was. And he met some people from Rome. He met Aquila and Priscilla. They were Jews who had been kicked out of Rome. And he met them at a certain place. And then he stayed at this guy's house, at the guy named Gaius in Corinth. And then he says, he wrote a letter to some of the other churches in the area. And he said, I really need to go to Rome. So we're thinking that, or at least I think that that's the point where he wrote this letter. He probably heard some of what was going on from Priscilla and Aquila and maybe Apollos and said, I really need to go see those people. But in the meantime, let me write this letter and I'll send that. And then when I can get there, I get there. And why? There were doctrinal disputes going on in Rome, and we'll get to exactly what those disputes were later. But he didn't think it could wait. He was in the middle of one missionary journey. He had something like a year left to go, and he had to visit several other cities and then go back to Jerusalem. And it was going to be, 1 to 3 years before he could get to Rome. So instead, he wrote a letter and sent that along instead. So let me talk about who Paul was. Okay. Paul was not always a Christian, of course. We all know some of that story. Historians believe that he was probably born sometime around 5 to 10 AD. And we don't know exactly. We don't really know exactly how old he was. Tradition says that he was in his 60s when he died. And he died in about 65 AD. So he couldn't have been born too much after 5 AD, but probably not before that, because when he was at the stoning of Stephen, he's called a young man. There's Scott. We let him in here. So in that, the word for young man is kind of ambiguous. In Hebrew, if somebody is called a young man, it probably means they're somewhere between 14 and 25, somewhere in that range. In Greek, it's a little bigger range. He could be anywhere up to 40, but probably younger than 30. So I would guess that he was probably in his late 20s, early 30s, something like that, fairly young, but still well established enough that he could go to the high priest and say, hey, give me some orders that I can go and arrest people. So he was taught by Gamaliel, who was a famous, well-respected Jewish rabbi. I mean, rabbi is a little anachronistic. They didn't call them rabbis at the time, but he was a Torah expert, one of the most famous rabbis of all time. And in Acts 22, Paul says that he learned at the feet of Gamaliel. That means that sometime in his youth, probably in his teens or, any time between he's 7 years old into his teens, he went to a school and spent a few years with Gamaliel learning Torah. He was a zealous Torah scholar and a Pharisee. Galatians 1:14, he says, I was advancing in Judaism beyond many of my contemporaries among my countrymen, being more zealous for my ancestral traditions. And this is because of his learning from Gamaliel. So not only was he learning from one of the most preeminent Torah scholars of his day, he was excelling over all of his other classmates and over the other people of his generation. So Paul was well on his way to becoming a successor of Gamaliel, of becoming one of those preeminent Torah scholars. He was present at the stoning of Stephen, which I had mentioned earlier. And in fact, he held the coats of the people who were stoning Stephen. He persecuted believers in Jerusalem after that. It seems like the stoning of Stephen was really what gave him his inspiration to start persecuting Christians. So he spent some time in Jerusalem persecuting the believers there. And then he asked the high priest for a commission to go to Antioch and other places in Syria and arrest Christians and bring them back. And I'm assuming that he must have had the cooperation of the Roman authorities to do this too, because you just can't go from one Roman province to another and arrest people and expect the Roman governor to be okay with that. So he had connections. He was not just an ordinary guy who had a wild idea. This was somebody who could go and speak to the high priest on his own, who could get the cooperation of at least 2 Roman governors, probably 3, because in order to get to Antioch from Jerusalem, you had to cross one of the 2 Roman provinces that was in between, whether it was the Decapolis or Perea, depending on which route he took, and maybe both. So he had to have the cooperation of all these Roman authorities. So Paul was a person of influence. He probably came from a well-known, influential family. Now, after his conversion, we all know the story of Paul on the road to Damascus. Yeshua confronted him, this blinding light in this great voice. And the people who were with him heard the voice, but they didn't see the light. And this happens in Acts chapter 9. And Yeshua stops him and says, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And blinds him. For 3 days, he couldn't see. And he went to Ananias in Damascus, and he stayed with Ananias for a bit. And of course, God sent a messenger. I don't remember if it was in a dream or a vision or what that was, but he told Ananias, this Saul guy is coming to stay with you. And Ananias, I'm sure, was kind of panicked about this because he'd heard of Paul or Saul at the time, and didn't want anything to do with him. It's like, this guy's coming to arrest me and you want me to bring him into my house? But he did. And it worked out because, he prayed for Paul. The scales fell from his eyes. And Paul became one of the greatest teachers of the gospel who's ever lived. After his conversion, he didn't immediately start preaching the gospel. This is probably a good thing. When people are converted into a new faith, it's probably a bad idea to immediately put them in charge of anything. They need to have some kind of probation period. They need to have some time to mature. Now, Paul already knew the scriptures backwards and forwards. He knew all the scriptures there were. There were no gospels, no epistles. There was just the Tanakh, the Old Testament. So he didn't need to learn that, but he did need to put it in a new perspective. So the first thing he did was he traveled to Arabia. Most scholars say that he went into the desert between Judea and Babylon, the area we call Jordan now. Personally, I don't think that's likely. Why would he go out there? I mean, other than just to go out into the wilderness and spend some time in the wilderness, and that's possible. I suspect he went to Sinai, which is also in Arabia, but it's in a different part of Arabia. And one of the reasons, well, I just like the poetic imagery of Paul going to Sinai to question everything he's taught. He has dedicated his life to Torah. So when he's challenged by this new thing that says your understanding of Torah is completely wrong, he has to go to the source. So Torah was given at Sinai. So that's why I imagine that Paul would have gone to Sinai. Purely speculation. I could be totally wrong on that. After he goes to Arabia, he comes back to Damascus for a while. Let's see, in Galatians 1:17 says, he did not go up to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me, but I went to Arabia and returned once more to Damascus. And he stayed in Damascus for 3 years. And while he was there, he went to the synagogues and began preaching. So he was preaching the gospel in the synagogues of Damascus for 3 years. We don't know exactly how long he was in Arabia. Again, just because I like the poetic imagery of it, I'm going to guess 40 days. But I don't really know. He did get into some trouble at Damascus. And I don't know if you remember the story where he was let down over the wall in a basket. I think I heard a lot more about that in Sunday school than I ever have as an adult. But it really sets the tone for all of Paul's ministry. He goes somewhere and he starts preaching, and then he gets stoned or chased out of town, and then he comes back. He was never one to let things alone. So he flees from Damascus and he goes to Jerusalem, where he spends 15 days with Peter. And he says himself that he didn't go to any of the other apostles. He says in Galatians 1:19, but I did not see any of the apostles except James, the Lord's brother. Well, let me back up a verse. 3 years later, I went up to Jerusalem to become acquainted with Cephas, which is Peter, and stayed with him 15 days. But I did not see any of the other apostles except James, the Lord's brother. So at this time, James, the son of Zebedee, had died. He had already been martyred. And he says the Lord's brother, so, we can pretty much assume that this is the one we know as James the Just, who wrote the letter of James. And he probably doesn't mean that he didn't actually see any of the other apostles. He didn't meet them or didn't spend time with them. I don't think that's what he means. I think what he means is that he did not go there to learn from anybody except Peter and James. He didn't seek out an audience with them because he did spend some time there preaching. So he must have ran into them at some point. He ran into lots of people. And it's very doubtful that he was preaching in Jerusalem and didn't meet any of the other disciples. So he spent these 2 weeks with Peter and James. Then he was preaching in Jerusalem. And then he got into trouble at Jerusalem. He started some riots. So he had to flee again, went to Tarsus, which is his hometown. In Tarsus, he spent several years using that as a home base, preaching throughout Syria and Cilicia. Syria is the area where Antioch is. And further inland, Antioch to Damascus, that's all Syria. Probably not exactly the same as the country we call Syria today, but also part of Lebanon. Maybe not quite as far east as what we think of as Syria. I'd have to look at a map. I don't remember exactly. But also the southeastern part of what we call Turkey. Sorry, letting somebody else in. Distracted. And of course, what they called Asia. And Asia Minor was split up into multiple Roman provinces, and Paul was from the province of Cilicia, where Tarsus is. So that's where he spent a couple of years there. We don't know exactly how long that was, but it was several years. It could have been up to 7 years that he spent preaching just from his home base in these two Roman provinces that he was very familiar with. All right, so moving on to his missionary journeys. Give me just a second here. All this talking's drying me out. His first missionary trip was actually to Antioch and Jerusalem. Now, of course, he had been preaching in Antioch, based out of Tarsus for a long time. He would go to places, travel around, preach at the various synagogues, but he didn't stay in Antioch. And what happens now is Barnabas comes up from Jerusalem. They send him on a missionary journey, and Barnabas is one of the second generation of apostles. He might have known Yeshua. I don't really know. But he was definitely a Christian before Paul was. But he heard about Paul. He knew Paul's reputation, or as the screen says, Saul. He was still going by the name Saul. And he wanted Saul to come with him to teach in Antioch. So he went up to Cilicia, to Tarsus, to try to find Saul, recruited him to go, and they stayed in Antioch teaching for a while, teaching at the synagogues. And from there, there was a famine throughout Rome, and apparently Jerusalem was hit pretty hard. So they took up a collection, and this is in Acts 11. Let me pull up my Bible here. So Acts 11:27. In these days, prophets came down from Jerusalem to Antioch. One of the curious things about Scripture is that everything is down from Jerusalem, even though Jerusalem is south and actually at a lower elevation than many of these places. Not a lower elevation than Antioch, because I think it's right on the coast. But from the perspective of the Jews and all of Israel, everything is down from Jerusalem. You go up to Jerusalem, you go down to Jericho or Antioch or pretty much any place else. So even though it was a few hundred miles north, they came down to Jerusalem, they came down from Jerusalem going up north. One of them, named Agabus, stood up and foretold by the Spirit that there would be a great famine all over the world, and this took place in the days of Claudius. That's the Emperor Claudius. So the disciples determined to send relief to the brothers living in Judea, and they did so, sending it to the elders by the hand of Barnabas and Saul. So Saul, the very one who had been intending to arrest Christians in Antioch and bring them to Jerusalem for trial and possible execution, was now collecting money from the people he was persecuting and bringing it to other people he had been persecuting. The reversal of things was, this is pretty dramatic. It wasn't immediate. This was many years later. Paul's conversion was immediate, but Acts almost reads like these things happened in quick succession, but there were many years between these events. I think, I haven't been mentioning these dates. Stephen was killed at about between 32 to 34 AD. Yes, Carlos, we have started recording. And Saul spent several years working out of Tarsus, or being a missionary out of Tarsus. And then he comes back to Jerusalem sometime around 44 AD. That's when that famine is recorded in history, or at least when most historians say it was happening. So this is at least 10 years, possibly 12 years from his conversion, that he is still operating out of his hometown. So he, after he took famine relief to Jerusalem, he returned to Antioch with Barnabas and John Mark. And this is the same Mark who wrote the Gospel of Mark. So from there, they spent a few years more in Antioch teaching. And then Saul and Barnabas were chosen by God, by one of the prophets there in Antioch, to go on a mission. So sometime around 46 AD, 46 to 48, in that area, Saul goes on his first missionary journey. And, we've been reading about this in Acts in our local fellowship here. And it's always talking about how Paul, led by the Spirit, went to this place, and forbidden by the Spirit, he decided not to go to this place that he had intended to go to. So led by the Spirit, they go first to Cyprus, an island in the Mediterranean, and then they go to Pamphylia and Galatia, which are back up in Asia Minor. These are just to the west of Saul's home area in Cilicia. While there in Pamphylia and Galatia, he's rejected by the religious leadership there, gets into all kinds of trouble, and then he begins using his Greek name. When he's in the city of Salamis, which I think is in Cyprus, there's a proconsul there who calls Saul to give him an audience. He's heard about this Jewish guy who's causing this trouble. And so he calls Saul to come speak to him, and Saul preaches the gospel to him. And while he's there, he says, my name is Paul too. I think we've talked before maybe about why he was called Paul and not Saul. And I heard this from Ryan White, who is a much better scholar than I am. I hardly know any Greek and Hebrew at all. But according to Ryan, when you put a Greek ending on the name Saul, it's Saulus. And it sounds very much like a Greek slang word for a homosexual man's walk. So going around the Greek world as a missionary saying, "Hi, I'm Saulus," probably wasn't going over well. And then he'd have to explain, this is my Hebrew name is Shaul, and this is just how Greek people pronounce it. So apparently Paulus was another name that he was known by. And after he met this consul named Paul, or Paulus, he decided he was going to start using that name too as a regular thing. So that's where he really switches over to the name Paulus. And I know that a lot of people really like to use Shaul. They like to call him Rav Shaul. And that's fine. That is his real name. But Paul himself went by Paulus. when he was out on his missionary journeys across the Roman Empire. So I can't imagine that he would be upset if people here in America 2,000 years later were calling him Paul. There are two things that happen right after this missionary journey, kind of in between his missionary journeys. And I'm not going to give them to you in order because the order that I want to give them to you is more about kind of the theme or the topical order. So the first thing was the Jerusalem Council. And Paul had spent most of his time, most of his ministry so far around Antioch. And some of apparently there was a lot of commerce among Jewish teachers going back and forth between Jerusalem and Antioch. And some of them were coming back to Jerusalem and saying, this Paul, he's teaching Gentiles not to keep the law. He's teaching Jews to give up the law and not circumcise their kids. And then they were going up behind him and saying, no. All you people, you need to be keeping the law or you can't even be one of us. And not just the law, you've got to be circumcised. It's not just circumcising your kids. You've got to be circumcised. You've got to, wash your hands before you eat. You've got to do all of this Jewish stuff if you're going to be fellowshipping with us. And they actually said, you can't even be saved unless you are circumcised according to the custom of Moses, which really wasn't the custom of Moses. It was their own custom. And so the Jerusalem Council is called to solve this argument. Paul and Barnabas came down and they said, we need you people to set this straight. So which way is it? Do we need to make all the converts become Jews? Or can they be saved and then learn to keep God's law? Do they need to keep Jewish traditions at all? And the unanimous decision at the Jerusalem Council was that they did not need to keep Jewish traditions, and there were no commandments that they needed to keep in order to become saved. But they said, here are a few basic rules, some basic etiquette for fellowship. If you're going to fellowship with Jews, you need to at least do these things because, otherwise they're going to have a really hard time with you. And then once you've done that, you can go to the synagogue and you can start learning Moses week after week. You can hear Moses taught at every synagogue in the empire. So we don't have to make you become Jewish. You can just learn the Torah on your own after you've come to faith in Yeshua. That was the decision of the Jerusalem Council. And this same controversy followed Paul throughout his entire ministry, everywhere he went. There were people, Jewish teachers, especially Pharisees, who would follow Paul around and kind of undo a lot of what he had taught people. He would say, Paul would be there and saying, you need to believe that Yeshua is the Messiah. You need to submit to his authority, repent from your sins. But you don't have to get everything perfect today. You can start learning now, and you are already in the kingdom as of this moment. And then you can start learning over time, and eventually, maybe you'll know as much as these Jewish guys that have been studying it their whole lives. But these Jewish teachers were going around behind him, what he called the party of the circumcision. And they were teaching people that, no, you are not saved. Not yet. You've got to go through this conversion process. And there was actually a 18 or 19 step process. I don't remember what all the steps were. I read about it years ago, so I may be getting the number wrong. I think it was an 18 step process that you had to go through. And circumcision for men was the last step in the process. So when they say you have to be circumcised in order to be saved, they don't mean just circumcision. They mean you have to go through all of these steps. And then finally, when you get to the end and you're circumcised, then we can call you saved. And Paul was saying, no, that is totally wrong. You don't have to go through any of this to be saved. You put your faith in Yeshua. You're saved. And now let's start learning how to live according to his standards. These are two separate things. And actually later on, they added a step to this process. And one of the steps was essentially denying Yeshua. So obviously believers and disciples of Yeshua would have a big problem with that. All right. right. Welcome everybody who's come in the last few minutes. Scott, Lisa, Jean, if I missed anybody, I apologize, but welcome. I'm glad you're here. The next big thing that happened between Paul's first and second missionary journeys was that the Emperor Claudius that we mentioned earlier, he expelled the Jews from Rome. And this quote from Suetonius, a Roman historian, tells us why this happened. It says, since the Jews constantly made disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus, he expelled them from Rome. Obviously, Suetonius didn't know who Chrestus was. Most historians believe that this is just a mispronunciation of Christus, which is the Greek word for Christ, where we get the word Christ. So this is talking about Yeshua. So the disturbances or the riots that were happening in Rome, Paul didn't even start those. These were happening long before Paul got there. People were coming and teaching Yeshua in Rome. They were preaching the gospel at the synagogues. And everywhere this happened, riots followed. And it wasn't the Christians who were starting the riots. It was the Pharisees, the Jewish teachers who were being threatened. Their power base was being threatened by this new teacher and this whole new set of religious authorities. Kind of off topic, maybe off topic, but several of Yeshua's parables were about replacing the existing authority structure in Israel with a new one. Not the priesthood, that's a whole separate issue, but the religious authorities in the Pharisees and the Sadducees, these people, they were the experts in Torah. And so they had recognized authority. And remember what Yeshua said about them. He says, whenever they're sitting in the seat of Moses or whenever they're teaching from Moses, do what they say. These people have authority because they know what they're talking about. Just don't do what they do because they're hypocrites. But we also know that they didn't teach everything right. They did have a lot of things wrong. And this didn't get better with time. It got worse. And when everywhere the Christian missionaries went, it caused disruptions because these people, primarily the Pharisees, who had power in all of these synagogues around the empire, when somebody started coming and bringing in, well, they weren't bringing in Gentiles yet, but started preaching that this new Messiah figure who was undermining the authority of the Pharisees, they were threatened and they would start riots. So this happened in Rome. And apparently it got bad enough that Claudius just kicked all the Jews out of Rome. And one of the side effects of this is that Gentiles who had started to come to belief, Gentile converts, were left in Rome without the Jews. So the Jews who had all the knowledge of Torah, and Paul even talks about this in Romans, they left. And now you've got a bunch of new converts pretty much on their own, trying to figure out what they're supposed to do. And they may or may not have had the scriptures. But we know that they had a couple of years of teaching, but we all know from our own personal experiences that a couple of years really is nothing. You can study your entire life and still not really have a solid grasp of most of scripture. By solid grasp, I mean understand all the nuances. I doubt that anybody on earth, except for Yeshua, really understood all the nuances of scripture. And so after just a couple of years of teaching, none of these people had access to Torah scrolls themselves. That was way too expensive. Now, maybe they had a Torah scroll, and maybe some of these Gentile converts still had access to the synagogue. It's even possible or probable that some Jews stayed behind when the rest were kicked out. When in a culture without the technology that we have today, even today, it's impossible to keep track of everybody all the time. You can tell all the Jews to get out. Doesn't mean they're all going to get out. But a lot of them did. And we know this from the book of Acts. We know that Aquila and Priscilla were two of the Jews who got kicked out of Rome at this time. And they lived for a while in Corinth, and they lived for a while in Ephesus, and Paul and Apollos both encountered them at those places. So this sets the stage for the book, Paul's letter to the Romans. In Paul's second missionary journey, right after this, he again traveled across Asia Minor. Along the way, he picked up Timothy and Luke, They went through Greece and then returned to Antioch by way of Ephesus and Jerusalem. So Paul tends to go to all the same places over and over. He goes first planting seeds, and then he comes back later to teach. Just, correct mistakes, like find out what's going on, how people are doing. This is the time where Paul circumcised Timothy. And this was immediately after he picked him up as part of his entourage. Timothy was a native to somewhere in, I want to say Galatia. I don't remember for sure. But as soon as Paul picked him up and he knew he was going to be visiting synagogues, he circumcised Timothy so that wouldn't become a problem for, the Jews that he was going to go and preach the gospel to. And this also shows that this is after the Jerusalem Council. And it shows that Paul was not opposed to circumcision totally. I mean, circumcision was still a good thing in its own context for its own reasons. Just circumcision is not the thing that makes you a believer. It's not the thing that makes you an Israelite. On this missionary journey is the one where he met Aquila and Priscilla, who had been expelled from Rome. They were living in Corinth at the time. Let me pull up Acts 18. So he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome, and he went to see them. And because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them and worked, for they were tent makers by trade. Tent makers, there's some controversy about exactly what that means. Did they actually make tents? It's more likely that they were textile workers, and these kinds of workers were called tent makers because that was one of the primary products of a textile work. It might have worked in leather or in goat hair or something like that. But, whatever it was exactly that he made, they had the same skill sets. So it was natural for him to go and stay with Priscilla and Aquila. On Paul's third missionary journey, he went to most of the same places he did on his first and second journeys. But this time he spent 2 years in Ephesus. Now, Aquila and Priscilla had moved on from Corinth, and now they were in Ephesus. And he spent 2 years there teaching with them. And then he decided to complete his journey and go on to Rome after this missionary journey while he was in Ephesus. And it's probably because Aquila and Priscilla were in communication with people who were living in Rome at the time. And they were hearing about some of the controversies that were going on there, some of the arguments and disagreements. And about this time, this is only about 5 to 6 years after Claudius had expelled the Jews, but this wasn't a permanent expulsion. It was really just a peacekeeping measure. He kicked them out for a while, and then he let them come back. And it's likely that between Paul's second and third missionary journeys, most of those Jews were coming back to Rome. Priscilla and Aquila decided to stay where they were. But they were probably getting letters and passing letters back and forth to their family and friends in Rome and hearing about some of the conflict that was going on there. And they shared this with Paul while he lived with them in Ephesus. And this is when he decides that he needs to complete this missionary journey, go back to Jerusalem and report to the apostles there. And then he would go on a fourth missionary journey to Rome and beyond to Spain. And while he was in Ephesus, living with Priscilla and Aquila, that's probably when he wrote the letter to the Romans in about 56 AD. So the way and the circumcision, these were the two factions within Christianity at the time. The way is what most people called, in the book of Acts, this is what they called the believers in Yeshua. The circumcision, these were also Christians. They weren't unbelievers. They weren't Jews who had rejected Yeshua as Messiah. They believed in him, but they were also trying to maintain their power. They were trying to maintain their authority as the teachers of Israel. And instead of relinquishing that to the disciples and the apostles as they should have, they were going behind the apostles and they thought that they were fixing the errors. I kind of went over that earlier, so I don't need to go over all that again. But this is the big controversy that followed Paul everywhere he went. These were Jews. They had accepted Yeshua as Messiah, but they still didn't understand that salvation was not dependent on Jewish tradition and identity. That they didn't understand that you didn't have to become a Jew to become saved. And they would follow Paul and other Christian missionaries trying to convince the Gentile believers that they needed to go through these 18 steps and become circumcised and follow all of the Pharisaical traditions in order to be fully saved. As we said, the Jerusalem Council confirmed that salvation is by faith and that Jewish traditions aren't binding on anyone, not even Jews. And that Gentile converts can learn Moses after receiving salvation. And note that by Jewish traditions, I don't mean the commandments of God. I mean the commandments of men that were added to the commandments of God. So things that Yeshua was constantly confronting during his ministry on earth. His disciples didn't wash their hands before they ate. Maybe that's a good hygienic practice, but it's not a commandment of God. That was a commandment of the Pharisees. And these are the kinds of things that they were teaching people that you had to do in order to be saved. So the Roman controversy, the Jews in Rome, one thing that I learned, was kind of surprised by, is that Rome had a large Jewish population as early as 139 BC. And historians were talking about them all the way back then. Paul was only the most prominent of many Christian missionaries in the empire. We already talked about Aquila and Priscilla, Barnabas and others. Apollos was another big name. We don't know for sure that he left us any writings. I suspect that the book of Hebrews might have been written by Apollos, but we don't know that. That's just speculation. But he was a well-respected teacher. And these people were also traveling all over the Roman Empire, preaching the gospel at the same time Paul was. Some of them started before Paul, like Barnabas. It's possible even that Apollos started before Paul. Paul is probably older and started preaching in Antioch and Cilicia before Apollos started. But it's clear that Apollos was traveling through Asia before Paul got there. And unfortunately, riots followed all of these people everywhere they went. So in response to that one riot about Chrestus, Rome expelled the Jews from Rome in 49. Gentiles continued studying and proselytizing without them. They were converting more people to Christianity, or I say Christianity, there's a lot of baggage with that word. I don't mean that they were converting people to, all of what we think of today as Christianity. They were converting people to the way, probably a better term. And it was belief in Christ, which is why I call it Christianity. It just wasn't what we think of as Christianity with all of our doctrines and creeds and all of our ceremony and all that stuff. They just didn't have any of that. And then when the Jews began returning to Rome after a few years, some of them wanted to reimpose their customs on these new Gentile converts. And when Paul heard about this from Aquila and Priscilla, he decided that he had to advise them until he could visit them in person. And so he wrote the letter to the Romans. So Paul wrote to the Romans in order to help Jews and Gentiles understand the role of the law and tradition in the salvation and life of a believer. What is the law for? What is tradition for? What is salvation, and how do these things relate? And this is what the entire book of Romans is about. And give me just a second to take another drink before I go on. All right, so I want to summarize the entire book of Romans, just kind of go through it very quickly. But before I do, does anybody have any questions about any of this, the background on Paul? Yeah, I think it's really important that we understand who Paul was in his history up to the point that he wrote this letter, so that we can understand what he is dealing with, what he might have been thinking. So are there any questions or comments there?
Can you do a quick just condensation of everything you talked about today from beginning to end? Just like a quick 30 seconds, like.
Sure, I can package that up nice and neat for you. Yeah, I'll get back to you on that. Okay. If there are no other questions, I will make a separate recording just for Carlos later. We won't share what's in it.
Yeah, that was a lot, but yeah, I mean, he was. You would think that he went through a quick transformation, but it wasn't. It definitely he went through a lot before he got to the point where we know him. I was very surprised about that.
Yeah, his initial conversion was quick, but it took him years to process this and figure out how to approach his new faith.
Jay,
All
did you
right.
say earlier that Paul went through Perea?
Well, he had to have gone through either Perea or the Decapolis on his way to Antioch or Damascus, rather.
Okay.
I don't know which one. I mean, I don't know which road he took.
The reason I ask is just before we started our meeting, I selected this background,
Hmm.
and this background is with me when I took the photo standing in Perea Elite, overlooking the Sea of Galilee,
Hmm.
just by chance. So anyway,
Yeah, that's cool. I think of most of that area on the east side of the Jordan. I normally think of it as just desolate, awful, salt flats and all kinds of horrible stuff. But there are areas around the Sea of Galilee and along the Jordan River that, at least from pictures, are really beautiful. And I'd like to visit someday. Okay, so Romans, we're just going to go through this real quick, kind of putting each chapter just into a sentence or two, just to give an overview of the whole book. Let me back up just a second. I know that most Christian teachers who cover Romans will say that the controversy was about whether Gentiles are supposed to keep the law or not. And Paul was writing to assure everybody that the law was just for the Jews and Gentiles don't need to worry about any of that. And I want to look at the book of Romans with an unbiased eye, but I also want to be honest with you. I have a bias. Everybody does. And I'm going to tell you that my bias is that Paul never taught anybody not to keep Torah. He taught everybody to keep God's law. Torah just is a Hebrew word that means instruction. And it's shorthand for the law of Moses or the first 5 books of the Bible. Sometimes it can mean more than that. But that's usually what people mean when they use that word. I'm of the opinion that that was not the conflict. The controversy was about whether Gentiles needed to keep Jewish tradition in order to be saved, not God's law. And it's not even about whether they needed to do anything to be saved, but about what is sin. Are we supposed to follow all of these Pharisaical traditions? Is that what defines sin? Do we have to listen to the Pharisees and the priests in order to know what's sin and what's not? Or can we just read the scriptures and find out from there? And Paul was writing them, assuring them that salvation is not dependent on this stuff. So don't put too much energy into worrying about it. It's good to study and to learn how God wants you to live. But that's not what determines your salvation or not. You can learn that over time. Your salvation is determined by your faith in God's grace. The rest is really, really important gravy, but it's still just gravy. So let me get on to this summary here. In chapter 1, he introduces it. The righteous live by faith, while the unrighteous rebel against God's law as it is revealed even in nature. In chapter 2, no matter who you are, pleasing God isn't so much about what you do, but about the state of your heart. And obedience is a natural outcome of a circumcised heart. In chapter 3, nobody can ever be good enough to earn salvation, and it's impossible, and it's possible to be saved without even knowing the law. If, one of the things that Paul talked about was that Gentiles who have never heard the law obey what's in the law because they still have part of it written in their hearts. In the garden, I firmly believe that humanity was created with God's law already written in our hearts. And sin is what corrupted that. But it doesn't erase it completely. We have to really work at it to really erase God's law from our hearts. So even the worst sinners have something of God's law there. And people who have never heard of Jesus or Yeshua or the Bible, most of them are keeping some of God's law because they have a conscience, because they know instinctively that some things are right, some things are wrong. And that's what Paul is talking about there. Chapter 4, Abraham was called righteous because of his faith before he had any covenant with God. He was declared righteous before he was circumcised. All mankind shares in Adam's guilt, and so all who believe in Yeshua can share in his righteousness. If sin came to the world through Adam, salvation, just one man, then salvation can also come to the whole world through one man. In chapter 6, those who believe in Yeshua have died as slaves to sin and have been resurrected as slaves to righteousness. In chapter 7, our death to sin frees us from condemnation of the law, but although we still struggle with temptation, we are still free by the perfection of Yeshua. So the law no longer has power over us to condemn us for our sins, because spiritually we have died and been resurrected. We've been born again. And so it was our old self who was guilty and under the law in that respect. So when we die to the law, we're resurrected, and now we are free to practice a life of righteousness. We're no longer under condemnation. And we're resurrected under the headship of Yeshua. And it is his perfect righteousness that God sees when he looks at us. I'm kind of summarizing a whole bunch of stuff. I may say things in a way that's ambiguous, or that I may not be exactly accurate. So, give me a little grace there. We'll clarify that later. Chapter 8. Having been freed from slavery to sin, we ought to live as beloved children of God. And children don't ignore the word of their father. They try to do what their father says, not because they're afraid of punishment necessarily, but because they love their father. All right, chapters 9 through 16. In chapter 9, God defines justice, so if he says salvation is by faith and not works, who are we to say otherwise? In chapter 10, salvation is available to all people regardless of their ethnic origins. The main point of the scriptures is to draw all people to Christ. So the scriptures, even though they were given to Israel, in the time of Paul, the term Jew referred to anybody pretty much associated with Israel. They didn't know any difference. So, even though Paul was from the tribe of Benjamin, he was still called a Jew. So anybody who outwardly identified with Israel at the time was just called a Jew. There were many people from the northern kingdom of Israel that had been scattered across the world, who may have had some common traditions, may have had some idea that they were Israel, but most of them had been absorbed and forgotten who they were. So in Paul's day, when they talk about Jews, they mean all the people that they know are Israel. There are a lot of other people who are Israel they didn't know about, but all the ones they knew, they called them Jews. It was just a shorthand. Words just change meaning over time. It annoys me to no end, but got to live with it. Chapter 11. God has not rejected the natural descendants of Jacob in favor of Gentile believers, but rather those Gentiles are adopted into the commonwealth of Israel alongside the native born. Some of Israel is cut off and other people grafted in, but they are not grafted in. But nobody in Israel is, or I should say the nation of Israel is not rejected in favor of some other people. But God's Israel is a combination of people who were born into the faith and came into faith later, no matter what people they were born into. In chapter 12, the proper response to God's gift of salvation is to love him in return and to show that same grace to others. As much as is possible, live at peace with all men. Chapter 13, showing God's love to the world, includes being a good neighbor and citizen, and God's law is intended to teach us how to do that. Chapter 14, avoid arguments over inconsequential and ambiguous matters. Don't judge another for differences of opinion, and don't tempt or offend a brother contrary to his conscience. We all disagree with each other. We all think that we're wrong. But if it's not something that is really going to ruin somebody's life, cause them serious spiritual damage, don't make a big deal out of it. It's okay for people to be wrong. We don't have to correct every error. Maybe we can correct them over time, or maybe we just let some people be wrong about some things for their whole life. As long as it doesn't undermine their salvation or anybody else's salvation, sometimes it's better to leave things alone. In chapter 15, work to live in harmony with each other and in a way that brings honor to Yeshua until Paul can come and visit them in person. And that's where this letter is really a stopgap measure until Paul intends to get there. Unfortunately, he was intercepted in Jerusalem and arrested, and he didn't get to Rome in quite the way that he meant to. Instead, he arrived in chains and was under house arrest for a few years. If he ever went on to Spain like he wanted to, we don't have a good record of it. Some of the early church fathers believed he did, but that's not really relevant to our conversation. So, chapter 16, treat one another as brothers and sisters in Christ and watch out for those who would create divisions among you. Throughout this book, Paul tells the believers at Rome that they're doing great. He's heard so many good things about them and their faith is strong. They just need to treat each other with more grace. Cut each other some slack. And that's one of the main points of the book of Romans. I think that's a pretty good summary. And I know that there's a whole lot more in the book, and we're going to cover it all if we can. So that isn't meant to address every issue in Romans, just kind of give you an idea of where the book is going. So, before I go on to the things to do, anybody have any questions or comments on the summary?
Yeah, Jay. So a depiction often, at least in my mind, that I associate with the early church is that it was simple faith, that the quote unquote Christians were fishermen, that they were simpletons, more or less. That's not what you just outlined. You outlined a very sophisticated, intellectual, if you will, letter to a people group that is all encompassing. I think it gives a lot more credence to, I don't know if intelligence is the right word, but it takes it away from Peter was a fisherman and it was based upon a simple faith, so to speak.
Yeah, and the Catholic portrayal of Peter as the first pope, I don't agree with that. But there is some foundation in reality in what we know of history. And, Peter and James seem to be, they're acting essentially as in a very priestly kind of role. I mean, they're not really priests, not like a Levitical priest, but they're acting in that role kind of like judges of Israel. They're staying there in the capital city, despite all the danger, despite the priests and the Roman authorities trying to catch them and kill them. They're sticking it out because this is the capital of Israel and they're going to stay there. Eventually that ends badly for everybody. And, most of them end up leaving, especially after 70 AD, pretty much everybody's gone. Let me let somebody else in here. And it's really common for skeptic scholars, if you want to call them that, to paint early Christians as illiterate country hicks. It's just not the way it was. The early Christian church drove literacy in the Roman Empire. I mean, they revolutionized education. Sorry, what was that, Scott?
The outline you just gave was the contrary to that. It was the very opposite, really.
Yeah, you've heard of a codex? A codex is the first book. Before a codex, everybody used a scroll. Before scrolls, they all used, clay tablets or, whatever they used in their region. The codex was the first book. And, Christians didn't invent it, but they're the ones who popularized it. They're the ones, because they had so many writings and they all wanted their own copies. Every synagogue, every believing synagogue in the way, and every Christian church wanted their own copies of the scriptures. And the simplest way to do this was to write them in a stack of papers. And then you could bind them. You could rearrange them however you needed to. And they were much more portable and easier to read and to find separate passages than in a scroll. So if you had a big scroll, like you've got all the prophets in a single scroll, and you want to find Hosea, some passage in Hosea. Well, now you got to unroll the whole scroll, trying to get to just the right place. If you've got a codex, maybe they didn't have page numbers, but you could flip through the pages to find the right place. It was much faster. And the reason that codexes very quickly replaced the scroll is because Christians needed to find scripture. They needed to find the references quickly so that they could really sit and talk to each other and study the scriptures together. So, Christianity, it brought literacy to slaves. That's how one of the major impacts it had on the Roman Empire. Most people were still illiterate, but Christianity is what started changing that. And then you get down later to the Gutenberg press, and what's the first thing he prints? Prints a Bible. All right, any other comments on that? All right, so we are it's only 10 after 8. So we do have time. I hadn't really prepared to talk about anything other than, this introduction. I do have some assignments for you. So let me go through that real quick. So things to do before next Thursday. All right, before I get to that, a couple of announcements. I've adjusted the events in the portal. So in order to get to the links for the meeting, when you log into the Common Sense Bible Study community portal, if you're on a mobile device, I don't remember exactly where it is, but I'm pretty sure there's a menu button up in the top left. Go to the menu button and then go to the events. And in the events, you'll get the links for the Zoom meeting. And it's the same thing if you're logged in on a website or on a web page, web browser, sorry. If you're on a web browser, there's a whole menu bar on the left. Let me open up a browser here and share my window with you so I can just show you. All right, so if you're logged in, it'll look something like this. And you can see the menu over here on the left. Click on events. And then this is all the list of events that we have scheduled right now. You notice that next week, July 20th, we're meeting, and then it skips July 27th and goes to August 3rd. That's because I'm going to be out of town for that Thursday and Friday, so I won't be available to do the study that week. So we're going to skip that week and meet back again on August 3rd. There's another event I'm going to add in here. If I hear back from somebody, I've got a surprise guest for everybody, I hope. I'm just waiting to hear back on exactly what day, but we've got a really great scholar that you would not expect who has said that he wants to come and talk to us about Paul in the context of first century Judaism. And this guy he's a world recognized scholar on both Paul and Judaism in the first century. So I think that's going to be a really interesting conversation. I'm definitely looking forward to it. I'm just waiting to hear back on his availability this month, so I know exactly when to schedule that. And then I'll let you know who it is then, just in case something comes up and he can't make it. What else we got going on? This month's theme is, of course, Paul, because we're starting one of his letters. Thought it was a good thing to talk about Paul. So if you have any thoughts, any questions, find any great resources about Paul, feel free to post them in the portal. Ask your questions, start some conversations. You can use the portal almost like Facebook or any other social media site. A little bit more moderation. And next month, I believe, next month's theme is going to be biblical leadership. So leadership after a biblical model. I don't want to call it church leadership because it's not necessarily about church leadership. It's about leadership as the Bible shows it. So we're going to talk about that. Got to find some people to maybe come and talk to us. Not sure who to think of as an expert in that topic, but I'm sure that there are experts out there. Unfortunately, there are a lot of people who think they're experts, and they might be good examples of non-biblical leadership. So the things I want you to do before next week: read the whole book. I know that sounds awful, but it's really not that long. It is 16 chapters, but not like chapters in a novel. Chapters in the Bible are usually much shorter. So it's really not that long. And you can even do an audiobook. And in fact, I've listened to it in 2 different versions just in the last week. So read or listen to the book of Romans, maybe more than once. And as you do, look for key words and phrases and themes. What kind of things does Paul mention over and over? What kind of phrases does he keep using? And then go back to chapter 1, because that's where we're going to start next week. July 20th, we're going to start at chapter 1. And as you read it more carefully in more detail, and consider how these key terms are used elsewhere in Scripture, especially in Paul's other letters. So if he uses a particular turn of phrase, check his other books. Check Colossians and Galatians and Ephesians and all of Paul's other letters, and even his statements in the book of Acts, to see how else is he using this same phrase or phrases like it. That's going to tell you what he means in the book of Romans. Consider that Romans was not Paul's first letter. It's put first in the Bible because they had this strange idea that putting the longer books first was a good idea. I don't know who thought of that. Maybe that had something to do with arranging a codex. I don't know. It seems to me that the earliest book should have been the first one. But I think most people believe that Galatians was Paul's first letter, at least the ones that we have a record of. Certainly possible. And don't limit your search to just Paul's letters. Consider how these words are used by the other apostles. It's very likely that Paul knew who Yeshua was during his lifetime. But did Paul actually meet him or see him at any time? I don't know. Since he was a student of Gamaliel, it's certainly possible because he would have been in Jerusalem for all of the feast days. So it's possible that Paul actually saw Yeshua in person. But he didn't spend a lot of time learning from him. In fact, he didn't spend any time learning directly from him. So I would really look more at how do the other disciples, especially Peter and James, how do they use phrases and ideas? And Paul's are probably going to be more closely related to theirs than to, anything that Yeshua said directly. And of course, the Torah, since Paul was a Torah scholar, if there are particular phrases that are used in Torah, that will have an impact on how Paul uses them. But also keep in mind that Paul grew up in a Greek-speaking area. And he quotes primarily from the Septuagint, or maybe exclusively. I don't really remember on that. So the wording is going to be a little bit different in the Septuagint than it would be in Torah. I apologize. I think I'm beginning to ramble here, but that does remind me of something else that I really wanted to say about Paul. I mentioned earlier when we first started that Paul was always in trouble. Everywhere he went, he was causing a riot or somebody was trying to kill him. And so he would run, he would get out of town, and then he would turn right around and go right back in and do it again. He didn't do that every time. Sometimes he would leave for a while and come back a couple of years later. But he never left it alone. He never surrendered. And I think that I really suspect that the Romans would have appreciated this about him, because this is a very Roman characteristic. The Romans had this strange way of winning wars where they would go and lose a battle, and then they would retreat, and then they'd come back and win. And the Romans just never gave up. They would lose battle after battle after battle, but each time they would learn something, and they would adapt their strategies to their enemy. Like, what is the enemy saying? Or how are they fighting back? How are they beating us? So then the Romans would change their tactics and their formations, their strategies in response to their enemy and come back and beat them. And they would win because they just never gave up. And this is exactly what Paul did. He said that, to the Jews, I became like a Jew. To the Greeks, I became like a Greek. And that's because he would go to them. He would argue in the synagogues. He would start a riot, get beaten, stoned, chased out of town. He would learn from it and come back later and have an established congregation. And he would go to them, and then they would go out and evangelize the rest of the city. And before long, the entire Roman Empire is Christian. because Paul never gave up. And I really think that that was a trait that the Romans would have admired. Another thought about Paul's cultural background is, although he could speak and write Greek fluently, it was not his first tongue. He grew up in a Greek city, in a Greek province, but his first tongue was probably Aramaic. His family was Jewish, and he learned Hebrew at the feet of Gamaliel, or well, he probably learned Hebrew at home, and then he fine-tuned it with Gamaliel. He probably spoke Aramaic on a day-to-day basis, but Paul's letters apparently are fairly poor Greek. For the most part, his Greek wasn't refined. He didn't write like a scholar. He thought like a scholar, and he argued like one. But his Greek wasn't so polished. It was he really was kind of like a hick in that sense. So he frequently used a scribe to write his letters for him. And he either didn't hire the most accomplished scribes, or they just wanted to write exactly what he said, because a lot of his own, Greek foibles come through in the text. I'm not a Greek scholar. I can barely sound out most of the letters. So these are things that I've heard from the books that I've read over the last few months, or books I've listened to, lectures I've watched. It's really Luke who, was a disciple of Paul, but it's Luke and possibly Apollos who wrote the best Greek in the Bible. Whereas Paul is some of the worst Greek, right next to Peter. I think Peter is actually worse. But that's kind of to be expected, since Peter did not grow up in a Greek area. All right, so that's a whole bunch more info dump. Any thoughts or questions on any of that? Nope. Y'all know everything. Perfect. All right, so
About
yeah. I don't think there's anything else we need to talk about tonight.
I'm looking forward to digging in, Jay. Thank you.
Yeah, in the future, I don't want to lecture for an hour and a half or 2 hours or whatever every week. I want there to be lots of discussion. So read the whole book, read the passages that we're about to get into. As much as you have time. I understand that not everybody has time to do a whole bunch of research and study, and that's fine. We're here to learn. So if that's all you got time for, is to just learn from other people, then great. I'm glad you're here and doing that. But if you have time, do some research on your own, do some reading, find out what commentators and other scholars have to say, and come prepared to share that, and especially share your own thoughts. That's what I really want to hear too.
one thing I found interesting that he was doing is that he had to find a way to keep himself afloat while he's doing all of this, right? I mean, the finances are part of it. And I think I read somewhere, I read somewhere that he said that he was a tent maker, right? So at some point, I think he was like trying to making tents just for a time, just to gather some money and then keep on doing what he had to do, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he made a point of not taking money from people when he could avoid it. I mean, he accepted donations.
Sure.
I remember in one of his letters, he writes to people and say, you have been so generous with me in sending me funds when I needed it. But in another place, he says, when I was with you, I didn't take a dime from you people.
Right.
Because he supported himself throughout his ministry.
Yeah. Found that cool that he did that. What about his family life? I think from conversations I've had with you before, I think he probably did have a wife at some point. Even
Probably,
if she's not mentioned, or I don't think kids are mentioned at all either, right? Or anything like that. His family's not.
Yeah, I know that some of his family is mentioned. I can't remember if it's at the end of Acts or the end of Romans. I think it might be at the end of Romans, where he mentions some of his kinsmen. And, nobody's really sure if he just means that they were fellow Jews or if they were actually related. Nobody really knows. But it would be very unusual for a Torah teacher to be unmarried. Jewish culture, if you weren't married and starting a family, there's something wrong with you.
Right.
And I think that his peers would have really looked down on him, and it would have been a point of pride as a Pharisee that he would have been married. And some of the early church fathers say that he was a widow or a widower.
Which kind of, I wonder how that worked with him in conflict of whenever he's telling everybody, well, telling some that, look, if you want to serve the Father, and we'll get to that, not in Romans, but in other ways, if you want to serve the Father, maybe it's better for you to stay, single.
Yeah. Yeah, he mentions that if he wanted to bring a wife along on his missionary trips, like some of the other apostles do, he could have, but he chose not to so that he could dedicate all of his time to the ministry. And yeah, that's not for everybody. But missionary trips aren't for everybody either.
Right.
Yeah, so I suspect that if he was married, if he was a widower, then his wife probably died either before his conversion or within the first few years after, because she didn't go with him on any of his missionary trips, and he doesn't mention her anywhere. Yeah, thanks, Joseph. Joseph points out that conversation about being celibate in ministry is in Corinthians. Any other comments or questions?
I found two of your observations to be very interesting. The first of his spending time in the Sinai, that very poetic. I really like that. That was pretty cool. And then the fact that he may have actually seen Yeshua, although not study at his feet. I've never pondered that. That's very interesting. When he was younger.
Yeah, he was living apparently in Jerusalem at the time that Yeshua was ministering. So I'd be surprised if they hadn't crossed paths at some point.
So like you mentioned, once like Yeshua, blinded him and then allowed him to see again, he didn't start the ministry right away, right? He went away for a while. But during that time, it's not like he wasn't relearning the Torah, obviously.
Yeah,
but
he was just adjusting his perspective
on his own.
Well, part of it seems like at first on his own. When he went to Arabia, he did it by himself, as far as we know.
How long was that for? Or
we don't really know. It could have. I suspect 40 days, but it could have been up to a couple of years for all we know. All we really know is that there were 3 years between his conversion and when he went to Jerusalem to meet with Peter and James.
Right.
So during that time, did he learn from Ananias or other people in Antioch? I suspect he probably did, but Scripture doesn't really say.
Yeah, there definitely had to be some kind of readjusting in his mindset. But it almost seems like he just, from the other apostles, just because that, him being a murderer for such a long time and that had such an impact on it, that he was, a lot more zealous. Well, he was a zealous man to begin with. He even says it himself, but he's kind of transferred, that zealous, hardened spirit from being a Pharisee to following Yeshua. But it almost seems to me that he kind of, I'm sure he talked to other people, but I think he kind of figured it out on his own. I think just through prayer.
Yeah, and he didn't spend, the time that he spent between his conversion and when he started teaching, it wasn't really that long. We don't know exactly how long it was, but sometime during those 3 years, he started teaching in the synagogues in Damascus. We just don't know how long it was.
Yeah, that's not may not seem like a long time, but it seems like a long time in a way as well. in a sense that he had to kind of remove a like old doctrine mindset and culture mindset from him. And I'm sure that's the tough part because the tougher part was the Torah that he had to didn't they have to memorize the Torah or something like that to be.
I've heard that. I don't know if it's really true, but yeah, I've heard that.
That's a lot of you got to be super smart to memorize, the 5 books.
Yeah, it was a whole different world. Memorization was how all literature was passed down for the most part. I mean, they had writing, of course, but most people didn't have access to that. The Jews were kind of an exception in that most Jewish men were at least partly literate. They were taught to read at a young age.
Yeah.
And, Paul coming from a wealthy family, which, I forgot to mention this too, but, Paul had Roman citizenship and he was born a Roman citizen, which means that his family had Roman citizenship. But, he was a Jew. Both of his parents were probably Jews. How exactly they got their citizenship, we don't know, but it probably means that his entire family was wealthy and well connected with the Roman society. I wonder how proud or embarrassed he was by that.
Yeah. I mean, he was, pretty much the perfect person for, the father to pick. I mean, this guy was trilingual. He was, zealous Jew, well studied, and the trifecta of it is the one you said too. That he had, Roman citizenship, and that allowed him to go to and fro from so many places. And I think there's a part where they were about to, where he was being, persecuted, and he was like, "Look, I'm a Roman citizen," right? And that kind of gave him a lot of clout,
Yeah, he got a free trip to Rome out of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, Joseph asked about Paul's age. That was pretty early on in the presentation, but most scholars believe that he was born in the first decade of the first century. So he'd be probably about 10 years younger than Yeshua, but nobody knows for sure. The only thing we know is that at the time that Stephen was stoned to death, right around 32 to 34 AD, Paul was still considered a young man. So probably 30-ish or younger. All right. Well, let's wrap it up. Call it quits for tonight. Carlos, would you mind closing us out in prayer?